Welcome to Mr. Carter Stories. Step into a world of gripping tales, unexpected twists, and unforgettable characters. Every story is a journey, whether it's mystery, thriller, drama, or suspense. There's always something to keep you on the edge of your seat. Are you ready for the next adventure? Hit follow, turn on notifications, and dive into the latest story. Don't just read, immerse yourself, comment, and be part of the experience. Let the storytelling begin. The exclusive rooftop bar of Manhattan's most luxurious hotel buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. It was a playground for the wealthy elite, where deals were sealed over expensive whiskey and arrogance was as common as designer suits. Among the crowd, Damian Knight sat at the center of attention, a man who had built an empire on ruthless ambition and unshakable confidence. With piercing blue eyes, a sharp jawline, and a demeanor that screamed power, Damian was used to getting what he wanted. Women, money, success. It all came easily. But tonight, fueled by alcohol and his insatiable need to win, he found himself in the middle of a dangerous wager. Across the table, his longtime rival and business adversary Grayson Vale smirked as he swirled his drink. Face it, Knight. Not every woman can be bought or charmed. Some are just out of your league. Damian leaned back, amused. I've never met a woman I couldn't win over. Grayson chuckled, exchanging glances with their other equally arrogant friends. Then why don't we test that theory? He leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel like a challenge. Ivy Carter. The name made the air crackle with sudden tension. Ivy Carter was a name that carried weight. A fierce, independent woman who had built her own business empire from the ground up. She was known for her sharp tongue and her disdain for men who thought money could buy anything, including her. She had publicly rejected some of the city's most eligible bachelors, humiliating them without a second thought. Damian smirked. Ivy Carter? That's the best you've got? Grayson's smirk deepened. If you think she's just another woman who will fall for your charm, prove it. Make her fall in love with you. Marry her. He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. Or admit there's one woman out there you can't have. Silence fell over the table, anticipation crackling in the air. Damian's ego bristled. He had no interest in love, but a challenge? That he couldn't resist. And what's in it for me? Damian asked, feigning boredom as he sipped his drink. 100 million, Grayson said, his tone daring. If you fail, you lose that much. But if you succeed, if you get Ivy Carter to marry you, you win the bet, and your name remains untouchable. Damian considered it for a moment. Money wasn't an issue. He had more than he could ever spend. But proving a point? That was priceless. A slow, confident smirk curved his lips. You've got a deal. His friends cheered, shaking on it as the bet was sealed with laughter and more whiskey. But as Damian gazed out over the city skyline, the weight of the challenge settled in. Ivy Carter wasn't just another conquest. She was fire, and he was about to walk straight into the flames. He had no idea that this bet, one made in arrogance, would change his life forever. Damian Knight was a man who played to win. His entire life was built on the foundation of knowing exactly what to say, how to move, and when to strike. Women were never a challenge. Until now. Standing in front of Carter and Company, the upscale boutique business Ivy Carter had built from scratch, Damian adjusted the cuffs of his designer suit and smirked. He had done his research. Ivy wasn't just a woman with a pretty face. She was a powerhouse. At 28, she had transformed her small, local fashion brand into an empire, gaining respect in a world dominated by men. She was intelligent, driven, and, most importantly, untouched by the charm of billionaires like him. But everyone had a weakness. Stepping inside the lavish store, he immediately caught sight of her. She wasn't like the women he was used to. No delicate silk gowns or soft smiles. Ivy Carter stood tall, her dark brown hair pulled into a sleek ponytail, her sharp green eyes focused as she gave instructions to her staff. Confidence radiated from her, a silent warning to anyone who thought they could underestimate her. Damien liked a challenge. "Miss Carter," he said smoothly, his deep voice cutting through the room. Ivy turned, her gaze landing on him with a flicker of recognition before settling into cool indifference. "Mr. Knight," she replied, her tone neither welcoming nor impressed. "What brings a man like you to a place like this? Looking for a gift to buy your way out of trouble?" A slow smirk tugged at his lips. "She doesn't play nice." "I was actually hoping to discuss a business opportunity," he said, stepping closer. "Over dinner?" Ivy crossed her arms, studying him. "Let me guess. You think a fancy restaurant, a few flattering words, and an overpriced bottle of wine will impress me?" Damien chuckled, intrigued by her resistance. "I don't need to impress you, Ivy. I just want to get to know you." Her expression remained unreadable, but her eyes held something close to amusement. "You don't want to know me, Mr. Knight. Men like you only chase things they can't have." "Maybe," he admitted, enjoying the way she held her ground. "But I have a feeling you and I are more alike than you think." Ivy shook her head, turning away. "If you think money and charm will get you anywhere with me, you're wasting your time." She started walking away, and for the first time in a long time, Damien found himself speechless. Women usually melted at the slightest hint of his interest, yet Ivy Carter had dismissed him like an afterthought. A lesser man might have walked away. But Damien? He was just getting started. In the opulent ambiance of a private dinner at one of the city's most exclusive venues, the air crackled with anticipation. The table was set with exquisite china and crystal, but nothing could hide the tension between Damien Knight and Ivy Carter. The room, filled with high society guests and business elites, fell into an expectant hush as the moment arrived. Damien, ever the picture of unyielding confidence, had orchestrated this evening with all the subtlety of a grand production. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Ivy, whose gaze remained cool and unflinching. "Ivy," he began, his voice smooth yet laced with challenge. "Tonight, you've shown me that you're not like the others. I want to know the real you, beyond your fierce exterior." Ivy's lips pressed into a firm line as she met his gaze. After a measured pause that seemed to stretch into eternity, she spoke. "Damien, I'll agree to your proposal." Her tone was steady, betraying neither excitement nor fear, only a deep-seated resolve. A collective murmur rippled through the room, shock evident in every whispered conversation. Guests exchanged astonished glances, unable to reconcile the image of the independent, defiant Ivy Carter with someone ready to accept a marriage proposal from a man whose reputation for conquest was legendary. Damien's pulse quickened. On the surface, he reveled in what he saw as an unmistakable victory. But beneath his confident exterior, a perplexing uncertainty began to stir. "You're agreeing so easily," he pressed, his voice low. "Surely this isn't a challenge to me. Why would you accept when you've always shunned men like me?" Ivy's eyes flashed with a complexity of emotions as she replied, "This isn't about love, Damien, nor is it about a challenge. I have my reasons. Reasons you wouldn't understand if you tried to pry too deeply." Her voice, calm yet carrying an undercurrent of sorrow, left as many questions as it answered. The announcement of their engagement spread like wildfire. Whispers filled the room as onlookers tried to piece together the puzzle. To everyone's shock, the fierce Ivy Carter had just made a decision that defied her public persona, a decision that wasn't born from romance or rebellion, but from a secret obligation and a personal quest for resolution. As the evening wore on, Damien's triumphant smile began to waver. While he believed he was winning the ultimate conquest, a gnawing curiosity and confusion took root in his heart. What secret could be so compelling that it forced the unyielding Ivy to surrender her independence so readily? And more importantly, what did it mean for the man who thought he was merely playing a game? The wedding was nothing short of a spectacle. The grand ballroom of the Knight estate had been transformed into a vision of opulence, adorned with cascading white roses, crystal chandeliers, and golden accents that reflected the wealth and prestige of the groom. Every seat was occupied by the city's most powerful elites, business tycoons, celebrities, and politicians, all gathered to witness what should have been a fairy tale union. But amidst the splendor, a stark contrast remained. There was no warmth between the bride and groom. Ivy stood at the altar, a vision in an ivory silk gown that hugged her frame perfectly. The delicate lace detailing on her sleeves, the shimmering veil that cascaded down her back, it was all flawless. And yet, her expression remained unreadable, her posture stiff, her hands cold as they rested in Damien's grasp. Damien Knight had seen many things in his life. He had conquered boardrooms, crushed competition, and played games with the most cunning minds in the world. But nothing unnerved him quite like the woman standing before him, the woman who had agreed to be his wife with no love in her eyes. As the officiant spoke, Damien stole a glance at Ivy. She was composed, poised, but distant. Not a flicker of nervousness, excitement, or even resentment crossed her face. He had expected resistance, perhaps defiance, maybe even hidden emotions she refused to acknowledge. But this unreadable silence, it was something he hadn't anticipated. His mind whispered a warning. She's hiding something. Do you, Damien Knight, take Ivy Carter to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, till death do you part? Damien's lips twitched into a confident smirk. He had won the bet. Whatever game she thought she was playing, it didn't matter. He had her now. I do. His voice was strong, unwavering. The officiant turned to Ivy. And do you, Ivy Carter, take Damien Knight to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, till death do you part? A heavy silence filled the room. Ivy's fingers twitched slightly, her emerald green eyes darkening. For a brief second, Damien thought she might say no, might walk away and leave him standing there like a fool. Then, finally, her voice came, soft but firm. I do. There was no emotion in her tone, no hesitation, but no eagerness either. Just a statement, cold and controlled. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the audience erupted in applause. Cameras flashed and guests murmured about what a power couple they would be, but Damien barely heard any of it. When he leaned in to kiss his bride, Ivy barely tilted her chin up. Her lips met his, but there was no warmth, no surrender. Just a brief, formal press before she pulled away, her expression remaining unreadable. As they walked down the aisle, arm in arm, Damien tightened his grip around her wrist slightly. What are you playing at, Ivy? He murmured under his breath, his voice laced with curiosity rather than anger. Ivy turned to him with a serene smile that didn't reach her eyes. I could ask you the same thing. Her words sent an unexpected chill down his spine. The wedding reception, a chilly affair. The reception was as extravagant as the ceremony, held in a massive hall overlooking the city skyline. 100 chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, and a live orchestra played soft classical music as guests indulged in a feast fit for royalty. Damien watched as Ivy moved through the crowd with the grace of a queen, greeting guests, accepting congratulations, playing the perfect role of Mrs. Knight. And yet, every time he caught her in a quiet moment, her eyes were elsewhere, far away, lost in thoughts he couldn't decipher. When they finally had a moment alone on the dance floor, Damien pulled her close, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You look stunning tonight. Ivy met his gaze, unreadable as ever. You should be pleased. The world believes this is a perfect match. And what do you believe? He challenged. Ivy tilted her head slightly, a small smirk playing on her lips. That you don't like not knowing things. Damien chuckled, though there was no amusement in his eyes. And you enjoy being a mystery, don't you? Maybe. She leaned in slightly, just enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. Or maybe I just don't want to make it easy for you. Before he could respond, she stepped back, her posture once again composed and untouchable. Damien clenched his jaw, watching her disappear into the sea of guests. For the first time in a long time, he felt a rare emotion slither into his chest. Uncertainty. This wasn't just a game anymore. His wife was keeping secrets, and Damien Knight didn't like losing, not even to her. The Grand Knight estate loomed like a fortress against the dark sky, its towering presence as cold and unyielding as the man who owned it. The drive from the wedding reception had been silent, the weight of unspoken words pressing between the newlyweds. As the sleek limousine came to a halt in the circular driveway, Damien stepped out first, adjusting his cufflinks, his sharp eyes watching as Ivy emerged gracefully from the car. Her silk wedding gown shimmered under the glow of the estate's golden lights, but despite its beauty, it did nothing to soften the distance in her posture. She hadn't looked at him, hadn't spoken a word since they had exchanged their vows. Damien had dealt with difficult women before, women who played hard to get, women who loved the chase. But Ivy Carter wasn't playing a game. She was a puzzle, one he hadn't yet figured out. And for a man who prided himself on knowing everything, that irritated him more than he cared to admit. As they entered the grand foyer, the massive crystal chandelier cast fragmented light across the marble floors. The household staff had disappeared for the night, leaving them alone in the sprawling mansion. The silence stretched between them, heavy with expectation. "You're awfully quiet," Damien said, his voice smooth but edged with curiosity. Ivy paused at the base of the grand staircase, one delicate hand brushing over the intricate railing. "I've had a long day," she replied simply, her tone devoid of emotion. Damien chuckled, stepping closer. "I imagine marrying me must be exhausting." She turned then, finally meeting his gaze. Her emerald eyes, sharp as ever, held no trace of warmth. "Not as exhausting as pretending this marriage is real." His smirk didn't waver, but something inside him twisted. He had expected her resistance. He had even enjoyed it at times, but now, standing in front of her, he found himself irritated by her complete detachment. "You agreed to this," he reminded her, his voice dropping an octave. "No one forced you." Ivy tilted her head slightly. "No, they didn't. But that doesn't mean I'm going to pretend to be something I'm not." Damien studied her, his gaze lingering on the delicate curve of her jaw, the way her lips remained pressed into a firm line. He had assumed Ivy Carter was experienced in love, that her defiance came from having played this game before. He had been wrong about a lot of things, but tonight, he would find out exactly how wrong he had been. A marriage of convenience or something more? The master bedroom was dimly lit by the soft glow of the fireplace, the warmth flickering against the sleek black and gold decor. Damien leaned against the bar, pouring himself a drink as Ivy stood near the window, her back to him. "You don't have to pretend, you know," he said after a moment. Ivy turned slightly, arching a brow. "Pretend what?" "That this is difficult for you." He took a slow sip of whiskey. "I know you've done this before." A sharp, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "Done what before?" Damien set his glass down, his eyes never leaving her. "This." He gestured between them. "Marriage, intimacy. You're not some blushing bride, Ivy. You're a woman who knows how to play the game." Ivy exhaled slowly, as if weighing her words carefully. Then, with deliberate movements, she reached for the delicate clasp at the back of her wedding dress. Damien watched, his breath slowing as the fabric loosened, slipping down her slender frame. The silk pooled at her feet, leaving her in nothing but lace. The firelight cast shadows over her bare skin, illuminating the soft curves of her body. She was breathtaking, but it wasn't just her beauty that held him captive. It was the way she stood before him, unflinching, unashamed. Yet there was something else, a hesitation, a stillness in her posture that had nothing to do with seduction. Damien's smirk faded. He stepped closer, his hand lifting to brush along her collarbone. But the second his fingers touched her skin, she stiffened. Not in anticipation, not in desire, in fear. He froze. "Ivy," he murmured, his voice unexpectedly gentle. She didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she clenched her jaw and whispered, "I've never done this before." Silence crashed over them. For a moment, Damien thought he had misheard her, thought it was some sort of game. But as his mind processed her words, something shifted inside him. Never? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Ivy Carter, the fierce, untouchable woman who had fought him at every turn, was a virgin. Damien stepped back, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't what he had expected, not in a million years. He had assumed her defiance came from experience, from knowing men like him and rejecting them. But now he understood. She wasn't rejecting him because she had played this game before. She was rejecting him because she had never let anyone in. And somehow, some way, she had chosen him. "Ivy," he said carefully, but she held up a hand. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't act surprised. Don't make this a thing." Damien exhaled sharply, staring at her as a million thoughts raced through his mind. This marriage had started as a bet, a game, a power play. He had expected Ivy to be difficult, challenging, maybe even ruthless. But he hadn't expected this. For the first time since meeting her, Damien Knight didn't know what to do. So he did the one thing he never thought he would. He turned away. Not because he didn't want her, but because, for the first time in his life, he realized he had never truly known her at all. The morning after their wedding should have been different. It should have been filled with the warmth of a new beginning, or at the very least, the charged energy of two people learning to navigate the tangled web of marriage. Instead, the silence between them was deafening. Damien woke before Ivy, his body tense with the weight of unspoken words. He wasn't the kind of man who second-guessed himself, but last night had left him unsettled in a way he couldn't explain. He had expected Ivy to fight him, to argue, to make their wedding night a battle of wills. He hadn't expected the truth. She was untouched. A woman like her, strong, independent, impossible to read, had never given herself to anyone. That single revelation had shaken something deep inside him. He glanced at her now, lying on the opposite side of the bed, her back turned toward him. Even in sleep, she kept her distance. The soft rise and fall of her breath was the only indication she was even there. Damien sat up, running a hand over his face. He had spent years believing that love, affection, even marriage were just transactions, something to be negotiated, controlled. He had played this game before. Women were predictable, easy to handle. But Ivy? She was a puzzle he hadn't solved. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to. The distance between them grows. By the time Ivy woke, Damien was already dressed, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse suite. The sunlight streamed in, casting a golden glow over his broad shoulders, but Ivy barely glanced at him as she sat up, clutching the sheets to her chest. "Good morning, Mrs. Knight," Damien said smoothly, turning to face her. Ivy met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Good morning," she replied, her voice steady. If she was expecting him to press her about last night, she was wrong. He wouldn't push, not yet. "Breakfast is ready downstairs," he said casually, slipping his watch onto his wrist. "I figured we should make an appearance before the rumors start flying." Ivy nodded, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. Of course, wouldn't want people thinking the perfect newlyweds aren't happy. Her words were laced with sarcasm, but Damien only smirked. "Perception is everything, sweetheart." She stiffened at the endearment, but she didn't argue. Instead, she rose from the bed and walked toward the bathroom, her posture composed, her walls firmly in place. And Damien? He let her go. For now. A public show. A private battle. The breakfast table was set for perfection. Freshly brewed coffee, a selection of pastries, perfectly sliced fruit. The mansion staff had outdone themselves, ensuring that the first morning of their marriage appeared as seamless as their wedding. To the world, they were a power couple, unstoppable, enviable, flawlessly matched. To each other, They were strangers. Ivy sat across from Damien, her expression poised as she sipped her coffee. From the outside, she was the picture of a billionaire's wife, elegant, confident, untouchable. But Damien could see it now. The distance. The way she avoided his gaze just enough to keep him at arm's length. "Do you regret it?" Damien asked suddenly, his voice low. Ivy looked up, her green eyes sharp. "Regret what?" "Marrying me." A tense silence settled between them. Then, Ivy set her cup down with a quiet clink. "Regret is a waste of time, don't you think?" Damien leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "That's not an answer." Ivy held his gaze for a moment before standing. "I have work to do." Damien arched a brow. "Work? You're the CEO. You don't answer to anyone." She gave him a small, practiced smile. "Exactly. Which means I don't have time to sit around playing house." With that, she turned and walked away, her posture unyielding. Damien let her go, but something inside him tightened. This wasn't just about a marriage of convenience anymore. This was a battle. And for the first time in his life, Damien Knight didn't know if he was winning. Breaking through the ice days passed and the distance between them remained. Ivy buried herself in work, attending meetings, traveling between offices, doing everything she could to avoid being home. Damien, on the other hand, found himself watching her more closely than ever. She was guarded, always careful, always in control. But now he saw the cracks beneath the surface, the way she tensed when someone got too close, the way she hesitated just a second too long before answering personal questions. He had assumed she was hiding something before. Now he knew it. One evening, as Ivy returned from a late meeting, she found Damien waiting for her in the study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "You work late," he noted, his voice casual. "I run a business," she replied coolly, setting her bag down. Damien tilted his head. "And you also run from me." Ivy stiffened. For the first time in days, Damien saw real emotion flicker across her face, something raw, something close to fear. But it was gone just as quickly. "I don't run from anything," she said, her voice steady. Damien stood, closing the distance between them. He didn't touch her, didn't try to trap her. Instead, he simply looked at her, searching. "You don't trust me," he said quietly. Ivy exhaled softly, her eyes flickering downward before she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Should I?" The question hung between them, heavier than the silence. Damien could have lied, could have reassured her with empty words. Instead, he said, "I don't know, but I want you to." Ivy looked away, her mask slipping just enough for him to see the vulnerability she fought so hard to hide. Then, before he could say anything else, she turned and left the room. Damien watched her go, his jaw tightening. She was slipping through his fingers, building walls so high he wasn't sure he could break them down. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about proving he could win anymore. He wanted her, not just her body, not just her name, but the real Ivy Carter, the woman she kept locked away. And Damien Knight had never been one to walk away from a challenge. Not now. Not ever. Damien Knight wasn't a man who liked being in the dark. He had built his empire on knowing things others didn't, on understanding his enemies, his allies, and everyone in between. But Ivy Carter, she was a complete mystery. And that was a problem. Sitting in his office, Damien scrolled through the private investigator's report for the third time, his fingers tightening around the edges of the file. The more he read, the colder his blood ran. This marriage had never been about him. It had never been about love. Never about money. It had been about protection. And the person Ivy had been trying to protect was someone he had never even known existed. The truth in the shadows. Damien had spent the past week watching Ivy closely, studying her movements, the way she avoided him, the way she buried herself in work as if she were running from something unseen. She was careful, guarded, but everyone had cracks. And now, thanks to the investigator he had hired, Damien knew where hers lay. The file in front of him contained the truth. Ivy had no public family, no parents, no siblings, but hidden deep in the records was a name. Lena Carter, age 17. A younger sister. A secret sister. Damien's jaw clenched as he read further. Lena wasn't just some relative Ivy had kept hidden out of privacy. She had been placed in the system after their parents' deaths, moving from one foster home to another. For years, Ivy had fought to gain guardianship of her, but the courts had made it nearly impossible. Then, 6 months ago, Ivy had finally won custody. And 2 months later, she had agreed to marry him. Damien closed the file, exhaling slowly. She had never wanted this marriage. She had needed it. But why? He already knew Ivy was wealthy enough to take care of her sister. She wasn't after his money, and she certainly wasn't interested in his name. Which meant someone had forced her hand, and Damien had every intention of finding out who. Confrontation and confessions. That night, when Ivy returned home, she found Damien waiting for her in the study. Unlike their previous encounters, he didn't mask his emotions behind a smirk or a sarcastic remark. He simply stared at her, his gaze dark with something unreadable. "You lied to me," he said finally. Ivy paused at the doorway, her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag. "I don't know what you're talking about." Damien pushed the file across the desk. "Don't you?" Ivy's face remained unreadable, but he caught the subtle way her throat tightened, the flicker of alarm in her green eyes. Slowly, she stepped forward and picked up the file. She didn't need to open it. She already knew what was inside. After a long pause, she whispered, "How did you find out?" "I make it a habit to know everything," Damien replied smoothly. "Imagine my surprise when I found out my wife has a younger sister no one knows about." Ivy let out a slow breath, her mask slipping just enough for him to see the exhaustion beneath it. "I wasn't hiding her from you." "No." Damien leaned forward, his voice deceptively calm. "Then tell me, Ivy, why did you agree to marry me?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it had nothing to do with love or convenience. It had everything to do with keeping her safe." Ivy's fingers curled around the edge of the desk. "It doesn't concern you." Damien let out a dark chuckle. "Doesn't concern me? You made a deal with the devil, sweetheart. And now I want to know why." Ivy clenched her jaw, her eyes flashing with something close to fury. "And what if I don't tell you?" Damien stood, closing the distance between them in an instant. He didn't touch her, but he didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to make her breath hitch. "You will," he murmured, "because I'm not letting this go." Ivy swallowed hard, her gaze flickering to the file once more. She had spent her entire life protecting Lena, doing whatever it took to keep her safe. And now, her secret was in the hands of the one man she had never wanted to trust, a man who, despite everything, was beginning to look at her not as a conquest, but as something far more dangerous, something real. Ivy had spent her whole life building walls, brick by brick, lie by lie, secret by secret. She had learned early on that trust was a weakness, that love was just another way to get hurt. And yet, somehow, against all odds, she had let her guard down. Not completely, never completely, but enough. Enough to let herself believe, even for a second, that Damien Knight might be more than the arrogant billionaire she had married. That maybe, just maybe, he could be someone she could trust. That illusion shattered in an instant. The worst possible way to learn the truth. Ivy had been in the middle of a charity gala, surrounded by people who pretended to care about things they never truly did. She had been making polite conversation, a flute of champagne in her hand, when she overheard the words that ripped the ground from beneath her. "Can you believe he actually did it?" A man laughed, swirling his drink in his hand. "I mean, we all joked about taming Ivy Carter, but Damien actually married her. The man never loses a bet." Ivy's fingers tightened around her glass. "The other man?" someone from Damien's inner circle, a wealthy investor, smirked. I'll admit, I thought she'd walk away. But I guess even the Ice Queen has a price. Damien always gets what he wants. The blood drained from Ivy's face. A bet. Their marriage had started as a bet. It had never been about her. Never about love. Never even about respect. It had been a game. A cruel, heartless game. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt too thick, the chandeliers too bright, the laughter around her too sharp. She set down her untouched champagne and turned, walking blindly through the sea of people. She needed to get out, away from the whispers, away from the truth, away from him. The confrontation. Damien found her outside, standing by the marble fountain, her back to him. Something in his chest tightened at the sight of her. He had been trying to talk to her all night, sensing the distance between them growing. But he hadn't expected this. Not until she turned. Not until he saw the fire in her emerald eyes, the fury, the betrayal. His stomach dropped. You knew, she said, her voice eerily calm. You knew, and you never told me. Damien took a step forward. Ivy, was it fun for you? She cut him off, her voice sharp as glass. Watching me fall for the lie? Did you enjoy playing with my life, Damien? His throat tightened. It wasn't like that. No? She let out a bitter laugh. Then tell me, how was it? Was I just another challenge to win? Another trophy for your collection? Guilt twisted inside him. Yes, it had started that way. A drunken bet, an arrogant challenge. He had thought he could make her fall for him, that he could tame her, break her. But somewhere along the way, he had been the one to change. Somewhere along the way, he had fallen. And now, it was too late. I never meant to hurt you, he said quietly. Ivy shook her head, her jaw clenched tight. Don't. Ivy. Don't say my name like that, she whispered. Don't act like this is something you regret now. You made your choices, Damien, and so have I. Her hands were trembling, but she lifted her chin, her strength never wavering. I should have known, she said bitterly. I should have never believed, even for a second, that you were different. His chest ached in a way he had never experienced before. Ivy, please. But she didn't let him finish. She took off her wedding ring. And without another word, she placed it in his hand. The weight of it burned against his skin. Then, before he could stop her, before he could fix the mess he had made, Ivy turned and walked away. And this time, Damien Knight had no idea if he would ever get her back. Damien Knight had never lost anything in his life. Not a deal, not a negotiation, not a single challenge he had set his mind to. But as he stood alone in the penthouse, staring at the empty space where Ivy's presence once filled every corner, he realized something with brutal clarity. He had lost her. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could win her back. The weight of regret days passed, and Ivy remained a ghost in his life. She had left the mansion, moved into a private apartment, and cut all ties with him. She ignored his calls, rejected his messages, and avoided every event where she knew he might be. It was as if she had erased him completely, and it was driving him insane. Damien sat in his office, his fingers pressed against his temples, trying to focus on the countless deals and investments demanding his attention. But his mind refused to cooperate. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ivy's face the night she walked away. The pain in her eyes, the betrayal in her voice. He had done that to her. And no matter how many times he told himself that it had started as a stupid bet, it didn't matter anymore. Because somewhere along the way, he had fallen for her, and now he was willing to do whatever it took to prove it. A grand gesture isn't enough. Damien had never been the kind of man to beg. He had always believed actions spoke louder than words. So, when he finally tracked Ivy down to a high-profile charity event, he knew exactly what he had to do. The event was a silent auction, an evening where the wealthiest elite bid on priceless items for a good cause. And Damien? He donated something no one ever thought he would, his company shares. The moment the auctioneer announced that Damian Knight had given up a portion of his empire to fund Ivy's charity for underprivileged girls, the entire room went silent. Ivy, standing in the center of the crowd, looked as though the air had been knocked from her lungs. She turned sharply, her gaze locking onto him from across the ballroom. For the first time since she had left, there was something other than anger in her eyes. There was shock, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of something softer. The confrontation Ivy found him outside after the event, her expression unreadable as she stepped onto the balcony where he was waiting. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady but quiet. Damian turned to face her, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You know why?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Do I?" He took a step closer, his voice rough with emotion. "Because I love you, Ivy." She inhaled sharply, but he didn't stop. "I was a bastard. I hurt you. I won't make excuses for it," he admitted. "But the moment you walked away, I knew. I didn't want to win a bet. I wanted to win you." Ivy's throat worked, but she shook her head. "You think throwing money at the problem fixes it?" "No," Damian said firmly. "That's not why I did it." She narrowed her eyes. "Then why?" He exhaled. "Because I know you, Ivy. You don't care about grand gestures or expensive gifts. You care about making a difference. You care about fighting for something real. And if I couldn't prove my love with words, I had to show you that I understand you, that I respect you." She was silent, her fingers trembling slightly as she crossed her arms. For the first time, Damian saw hesitation in her. Not rejection. Hesitation. There was still hope. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she whispered. Damian swallowed hard, stepping even closer. "Then let me earn it." She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint of the man who had once played her for a bet. But all she saw was sincerity, pain, and love. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ivy let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted. Damian reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Then I'll wait." Ivy blinked, surprised. "No games," he promised. "No bets, no lies. Just me, fighting for you." For the first time since the night she walked away, Ivy didn't pull away. And maybe, just maybe, Damian Knight had finally taken his first real step toward redemption. The city lights stretched endlessly before her, a glittering sea of possibilities. But for Ivy Carter, standing at the edge of everything she had fought for, there was only one choice left to make. Would she trust Damian again? Or would she walk away forever? The final confrontation. She found him where she knew he'd be, standing in his penthouse looking out at the skyline, the place where it had all begun. Damian turned as she entered, his expression unreadable, but his eyes told her everything. He was waiting. For her decision. For her. Ivy exhaled slowly, her pulse hammering in her ears. "You said you'd wait," she murmured. "I meant it." Damian's voice was raw, quiet. "But if you came here just to say goodbye, Ivy..." He swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "I won't stop you." Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She had spent so long running, from love, from pain, from the risk of getting hurt. But Damian, he had stopped running. He had changed. And now she was the one standing at the edge, afraid to jump. "You broke me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know. You made me believe I was nothing more than a game." Damian flinched, but he didn't deny it. "Ivy, but you also made me feel something I never thought I could," she admitted, her heart pounding. "You made me hope." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Then Damian did the one thing she never expected. He stepped back, not forward, back. "I love you," he said quietly, "but I won't force you to stay. I won't fight you if you want to leave. This time, the choice is yours." Ivy's breath hitched. For so long she had been waiting for him to prove himself, to fight for her. But this was what she had truly needed. For him to let her go. Because love wasn't about winning. It was about choosing. And in that moment, standing there, Ivy chose. The decision tears burned in her eyes as she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, shattering the wall she had spent a lifetime building. Damien barely had time to react before she grabbed the lapels of his jacket and kissed him. Fierce. Desperate. Real. Damien inhaled sharply, his arms wrapping around her as if she might disappear. He deepened the kiss, pouring every ounce of regret, love, and longing into it. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, his breath unsteady. Does this mean? Ivy smiled. A real, unguarded smile. It means you're stuck with me, Knight. Damien let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding his features. I was hoping you'd say that. The epilogue. Love that defied the odds. A year later, Ivy stood beside Damien, watching as her sister Lena laughed with guests at a charity gala they had built together. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of love. Ivy glanced at the man beside her, the man who had once been her greatest mistake and had become her greatest love. You still think you won the bet? She teased. Damien smirked, pulling her closer. Sweetheart, I lost the moment I fell for you. Ivy laughed, pressing a kiss to his lips. Some love stories weren't meant to be easy. Some had to be fought for. And theirs? Theirs had defied all odds.